This now would be the time to turn on. Welcome back, everybody, from the break. This is Keynote Panel 2, the Interdisciplinary Exploration of Meditative Inquiry. There's 3 panelists in this session, starting with Dr. Balaganapathi Devarakonda. Dr. Devarakonda is a professor of philosophy at the University of Delhi in India. His research interests are in the areas of Indian philosophy, philosophy of religion, and philosophical practice. The title for his talk today is Exploring the Focus of Human Action, a space that conflates meditative inquiry and philosophical counseling. The second to speak will be Dr. Michael Fisher. Dr. Fisher is an artist, independent scholar, educator, and fearologist. He is the director in the In Search of Fearlessness Research Institute and an author of many articles and books on transformation and liberation. The title for his talk today is Meditative Minding, a Fearlessness Worldview Through Dialogue. It won't be easy. The third presenter is Dr. Kelly Resmer. Dr. Resmer is a chemistry lab instructor at Mount St. Vincent University. She teaches a variety of labs ranging from first year general chemistry to third year intermediary metabolism. The title for her talk today is Chemistry, Laboratory Teaching and Learning Guided by Meditative Inquiry. Before the panelists begin, Dr. Fisher is going to lead us in a meditation. Just hand over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. So this will just be about three or 4 minutes. So just get comfortable in your seat. If you're seated or laying down, make sure your feet are on the ground, nice and flat, legs are uncrossed. So just a little bit of relaxation here in a guided meditation. So you can slowly close your eyes if you wish. Take some breaths, a little extra deep, and then relax. And you don't have to do deep breaths, but just notice your breathing. Eyes gently closed. Notice any tight muscles you might have. Just allow your body to move a little bit so that none of those tensions maintain themselves. Just loosen them up. Noticing your breath again. I just want you to just take a moment to go to a spot, a place that you like to go to as your sit spot. It could be your power spot, your calm spot. It could be a physical place, it could be an imaginary place. So let's just go there hang out in that place. You could just go there and notice all the things around that surrounding that place. And as you're in that place, allow your senses to receive any stimuli, orally, visually, in any way, any sensory experience. Just take it all in. Accepting it all. This is your place for the moment. And just slowly pull yourself back into your body where you are. Attending still to the place, all the happenings there. And just accept everything as one whole, one unity, even with all the diversity of its pulses, experiences at this place. One whole. In that embrace of that wholeness, just return that wholeness from your being in that place and extend that wholeness out to the rest of the world, to the cosmos. Just let it go. Let it expand. Great. Now let's bring ourselves back to your seat, letting that expansion keep on going in a continuous thread, continuous flow. And you're bringing now your energy of this wholeness back to this group where you're sitting now, in the presence of this place, this conference, this Zoom chat. And then just as you come back, just a moment of gratitude to all that wholeness that's ongoing, you're part of, and that you just extended. Moment of gratitude for it all. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to swap you over to Dr. Devarakonda, and just remind everyone that each panelist will have 20 minutes, and I'll give you a verbal 3-minute warning. Okay, over to you.
Yeah, namaste. Friends, I'm so happy to be on this platform today in this conference on engaging with meditative inquiry in teaching, learning, and research. This particular panel is titled Interdisciplinary Exploration of Meditative Inquiry. So I understand my colleagues who are going to speak after me. One is from chemistry and one is from sociology. So I'm speaking from philosophy. So it's really a multidisciplinary kind of an approach that we are going to witness now. I'm so grateful to Professor Ashwini Kumar for this kind invitation, which helped me in a way to look at the meditative inquiry carefully and try to understand it. Actually, we have been doing it in philosophy, but look at it from the process within the domain of teaching and learning is something that he prompted me to look at, understand. And also to say something about myself, I have been teaching philosophy in Delhi University, and I am also working on philosophical counseling. So we thought human concerns are not just biological in nature, they are also psychological to some extent, and they are beyond the psychological and biological as well in terms of spiritual. So how do we address, and also when we address existential issues, etc., how do we address them only as within the as something that is within the domain of modern experimental science? Now, how do we do it beyond that? So that's where philosophy comes into picture, because all of us at some point of time or the other face some existential crisis, and it's not that once we have crossed it, we don't face it again. So for such kind of things, we definitely need some support of a philosopher, trained philosopher, who can help us in a better way in dealing with the situation. So that's how philosophical counseling has gained prominence in the recent past. And that's what we have been advocating. So now Dr. Ashwini has given me a chance. And in fact, he is also exploring the intersection between philosophical counseling and meditative inquiry. So I'm glad to speak about that a little today. I have planned my talk this way. I know that I am given 20 minutes, so I'll try to finish it in 15 minutes if possible. I'll try to map the domain of this whole discussion to be human action. And then I'll also talk about this, the conflation of meditative inquiry and philosophical counseling a little. And most important aspect of these two is self, but self is at the center. How is it at the center is important for me. So that's what I would talk about a little. And then I'll talk a little about Indian traditional system of various concepts in Indian traditional system, which can help us in understanding meditative inquiry in a better way. So this is my plan of action now. When we talk about, because the title that I have chosen today is exploring the focus of human action and the space that conflates between meditative inquiry and philosophical counseling. So my focus is on human action. When we look at a human being, how do we understand it? If we try to, in general, explore into the individuals, human beings, human nature as such, at least two things cannot be avoided. At least one thing, that's relationality. We always try to relate ourselves with the other, and that's how we live. The life itself is relational in nature. Though we do possess our own life individually, but when we are living, we are in fact interacting with the other. Otherwise, it's living in a vegetative state is not considered to be living as such. Living in relation to the other is very important. We are very much bothered about living in relation to the other, and what is it that underlines this living in relation to the other is very important. What we limit it to or reduce it to this living is physical living in relation to the physical relations and other social relations that we have around us, only in terms of being in the physical space. That's definitely one of the important aspects, but there is something deeper that is to be looked at, like how do you relate yourself to yourself? So there is some saying, I read it somewhere, which says that you met so many people in your life. That's fine. Did you ever meet yourself, your own self? No? Then you have missed the most wonderful person that you must meet, right? So how do you relate to yourself? How do you meet your own self is very important for philosophical inquiry as well as for meditative inquiry. So that's why this relational aspect is very important. And this relational aspect doesn't mean it is only a space without any activity. This relational aspect for me is a genuine human action. Okay, when you are trying to relate yourself with the other, yeah, you can mentally relate yourself with so many people, but your relationality gains its meaning only when you try to act in terms of speaking, in terms of acting, doing something for the other. So that's why the domain of relationality is also the domain of the human action. That's how we relate ourselves as doers, agents, doers. Of course, these terms also have some problematic connotations, which I would try to talk about towards the end if I get time. But otherwise, doership is very important in human life. That's what makes you relate yourself to the other. So that's the domain within which I'm placing this whole discussion. Moving forward, how do the conference is on meditative inquiry, teaching and learning, right? This falls under the domain of epistemology. Human epistemology is very interesting to explore. In fact, it's so close to all of us, and it is a part of all of us, and that is what we are. But unfortunately, we don't give time to explore into this human epistemology, and we don't even encourage our youngsters, students, to explore into this human epistemology, which is a problematic thing. And in fact, that's what we are supposed to do in the process of teaching and learning. So for me, knowing is definitely an act of doing, right? It's not that only when you walk, you're doing. It's when you're knowing also, you're doing something, right? So, but how do we learn? Mostly we say that, yeah, you learn through your experience, you learn through studying, doing reading, etc. All right. There may be 100 ways of learning that we can talk about. Okay. But how is this inquiry related to study and learning is very important to me, because we are talking about meditative inquiry. And how is this inquiry related to study and learning? And when we say that we are inquiring into something to study and learn, I'm just trying to be a little analytical here. So when you actually think of studying something or reading something or trying to know something, learning, what is required is some space which we call focus. It's termed ekagrata in Indian tradition. Ekagrata is focus. And what is this ekagrata means? It's internally being attentive to the external object of learning or knowing. So this is very important, which means you're bringing subject and object together. The object of learning and the subject of learning is brought together through this focus called ekagrata. So this ekagrata tells us that the learning process is not just an external kind of one. Okay. Of course, there is an object of learning that we are trying to learn. And there are senses which are operating and which are trying to provide things to us, to the subject. It doesn't limit at that level. No, it goes a step beyond and tries to reach out to the mind, because mind is the one which has to operate these senses in learning and studying. So if that is happening, is it that the mind is automatically doing it? Of course, mind may be focusing the ears in making my words listen, and focusing on eyes in making what is happening around us see. But is that enough? Is that focus enough? Or is it that it requires something more than that? Is the point that I'm interested in. I would say that's not enough. Okay, you have some object of learning available, and you have your senses operating. Okay, there is stimulus and there is a subject who is receiving it. And this subject, it's not that the subject has only senses. Along with senses, he has mind, which is focusing the senses onto the object of learning. Now, is that enough? Okay, so which means inquiry is only up to here, up to the mind. But now we have added through the work of Dr. Ashwini, the meditation. So why is it that meditation is required if the mind's focus on sense organs onto the object is enough? No, that's not enough. So that's where meditation comes into picture. In fact, when you try to learn, okay, when you gather information from your stimulus, okay, into onto your senses, and once the mind also receives it, you have to pause. Okay, this pause is very important. The focus is not just focus of the sense organs onto the object. The focus is also the internal focus of the mind as to what I have received already is to be absorbed. So that's why the meditation is important. Meditation makes what you have already learned, meditative inquiry, meditation basically makes you internalize whatever you have already received in the process of learning. And meditative inquiry pushes you to understand what you have already received by inquiring into that, okay, and see whether you have understood it in a proper way. So I'm just trying to posit different levels of looking at this whole process. The object of learning, and then the sense organs which are receiving it, and then the mind which receives it. But that's not enough. Then there is a meditation in the sense of focusing, internally focusing on the material that is received. And then it's not enough focusing on it, because by focusing on it, you're only seeing different things in front of you. You also have to inquire into what you have focused internally, to see whether you have really understood something and gained something which can be again put into practice. So that's what is important. That's why this meditative inquiry is important to me. And that's where the concept of pause, temporarily stopping your activity is required. So how do you do this internal processing? You can do it only when you pause your receiving some more data into your self. Okay, so this pause in the human activity is very important to me. In fact, I have developed this pause in the human activity as something that is ethical, and I argued elsewhere that this pause in the human activity can work well for the sake of the environmental degradation that we are talking about and the pollution, etc., that's happening. During COVID-19, what has happened was all human activity was paused temporarily. And this pause has helped nature to recuperate itself. And you know what happens during the fasting patterns? Various religions prescribe fasting patterns. They ask you to stop yourself from eating, at least for some time. A particular pattern is prescribed by every religion. Why is it so? Because this pausing is required for the human being to survive and be healthy. Okay, so that's where I strongly advocate this pausing at every point of time. Don't be hasty in reacting. Pause a little, then your reactions would be different. And this pause itself is meditation, a form of meditation. The pause itself is a form of meditative inquiry to me. So that's how the focus, ekagrata, that I'm talking about is internalizing the learning and knowing. And until then, it doesn't become a part of your knowledge. So it's not that by knowledge, we talk about something that I see, that our senses are attentive to. And it's not that mind has received it. No, it doesn't end there. It goes far beyond that. This is the important aspect of meditative inquiry that I thought I should talk about. And then I quickly move to the conflation between meditative inquiry and philosophical counseling. In fact, I have organized a conference this year, January, and where Dr. Rashmi has presented a brilliant paper on the relation between meditative inquiry and philosophical counseling, or approaching philosophical counseling from the side of meditative inquiry. We have already understood by the lectures, talks that we have been witnessing since day before yesterday, that meditative inquiry is essentially the art of awareness. And its central focus is developing a deeper understanding of how one thinks, acts, and feels in everyday life. Similarly, when we talk about philosophical counseling, it's basically, it tries to make a radical contribution by challenging the superficial, technical, and commercial orientation of modern psychology, where the goal is to help the individual to fit into some prevailing social and institutional systems, rather than questioning and freeing the individual from these institutional systems. And that's where philosophical counseling is very useful, and it has an edge over the modern psychology that we have been practicing now. But of course, I believe that
3-minute warning.
Philosophical counseling has to go with the developments in psychological counseling that is happening now. So that's where I see that both of them coming together. Now that I have only 2 minutes, let me briefly talk about the self. In both meditative inquiry and philosophical counseling, the self is more important. Self is at the center. Self is the knower. Self is the agent. But self is also an observer for me. So meditation helps you to observe not the outside things. Okay, the mind focusing through the sense organs is observing the outside things. The internal observation is very important. Internal processes, observing them is very important. So what is this observation? Observation of the internal change and also the improvement within the individual is very important. That is how you gain through this meditative inquiry. You observe processes within and around. So that's what is key to philosophical counseling for me. There are certain Indian traditional concepts like Sravana, Manana, Nidhityasa. Okay, this is the way Advaita Vedanta, one of the philosophical systems of India, tries to teach us the process of learning. So I thought I would talk about that, but some other time. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm glad that I'm here today sharing my knowledge and listening to others. And I thank once again Dr. Ashwini for this wonderful invitation. And the book is very useful. And I read some of the chapters that I thought which are important to me. I really appreciate the efforts of Dr. Ashwini and his colleagues in organizing this event and developing this concept. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bala. And now we are going to switch over to Dr. Fisher, who will take over. And again, I'll give you a 3-minute warning.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm going to refer to Ashwani Kumar as AK during this presentation. There's a little bit of a joke and humor in that, but it's that I don't want to keep repeating his name over and over because it's repeated so often in his book. And I don't want to inflate his ego beyond what it might already be as a young person. And I've been through the academy, just a very brief about me, for about 30 some years and many degrees to a PhD in curriculum and instruction. Been a school teacher before that, but I've had many careers. And the point of saying all of that is that I'm a very transdisciplinary thinker. And so yes, I have a strong sociology background, as Bala mentions, but also psychology, philosophy, theology, and so on. And then, trying to put that into education. Well, a little brief story about my daughter visiting me as a 40-year-old coming back. And I think this tells you something about myself. She said to me the other day visiting, she's going into law, working on Bay Street in Toronto, the total opposite of me. And I'm going, how much can my daughter be going into law in this legal field and the economic system? I'm this artist, rebel, bohemian. And she says to me, so do you have any regrets, Dad, in your life, of all the careers you've been through? And I said, yeah, I really wish I would have gone in to become a cultural psychiatrist. And she says, what? Cultural psychiatrist? Well, there isn't such a thing, is there? I says, well, there should be. And then she says, well, why didn't you go into it? And I says, well, 2 things. I don't trust culture and I don't trust psychiatry. And that's why I didn't go into it and I went into education instead. Well, what does education sort of mean to me? And I'm just picking a little kernel here today in the moment, responding to Bella that, this whole importance of the heart of awareness and the self and getting to know the self and meet the self. And what I sort of really think about both culture and psychiatry is these are worlds in philosophy as well. The whole self is so infused with self-deception that, the whole idea of human epistemology, as Bella mentions, right? So I'm just spinning to say that I've just given you a little bit of a caveat and perhaps a warning about what I'm going to talk about today. The concept of self-deception is not a pleasant one. for us who think we know ourselves, that we think we know reality, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, I'm going to hook that now to a few collaging ideas and quotes from the book by AK, editor, and many wonderful minds that are behind it. Many of those minds I know and have followed for many decades of their work as well. And I'm going to be coming from a perspective I call a fearlessness worldview. And theoretically, that fearlessness worldview, some in the East will go, oh, we know what that is. Some in the West will go, wow, okay, do you mean fearless? Do you mean no fear, without fear? And I go, well, there's a big problem between the East and the West and how they understand fearlessness in my research. So fearlessness worldview applied to meditative inquiry, education, but particularly the book. So I'm going to just collage a few quotes from the book as I perused it in preparing for this talk. And I've also spent a bit of time with AK, and we actually did one of the meditative inquiry dialogues together and published that about 1.5 years ago. So I'm going to start with in the book. A person called Mike at one point, who's I believe is a teacher, practicing teacher, and they talk like this. And fear ultimately is the biggest source of conflict from my understanding of this philosophy or approach. Fear drives so much out there. Mike continues in this conversation. I do not want to go in there with fear, referring to go into the classroom. Another piece of collage from the book. Dr. Susan Walsh, colleague of mine, and AK knows very well. They worked together at Vincent and so on. Susan Walsh writes in her chapter as she's doing a poetic inquiry into the contents of the book on meditative inquiry. She writes, I begin with fear because fear is central to Ashwani's work. And the third piece of collage quote, AK writes 7 key principles to meditative inquiry. I always look, which one did they put first? It's always interesting. Maybe it's relative, maybe it's not. Based on what Susan Walsh just said, I begin with fear because fear is central to Ashwani's work, quote. Here's what Ashwani's first key principle is, opening the chapter of the book. Questioning deeply about everything without fear, quote. So you can see that I've got this little mind, the investigative, inquiring mind, that snoops around to see what is said and what is not said in educational practice, in philosophizing about education, etc., and about ourselves. What do we say? What do we not say? What do we inquire into? What do we not? And so I'm interested in the notion of what are we attracted to? What do we put forward as virtue and like to surround ourselves with virtue? And what do we not want to see that might be attached to that virtue on the other side, called vice and the vices? So you can see I'm very much interested in both of those, the virtues and the vices, and how they rub up against each other. How knowing, how I know myself, truth, reality, whatever it is, and what rubs up against that truth and knowing is what I don't know, what I'm self-deceiving of, what I don't want to pay attention to. Right? So fear and how it's related to all that. Let's just suggest that this book, this methodology that is not a methodology according to AK and others, perhaps, this practice, this process, if you want to call it that, meditative inquiry is an approach to education, learning, teaching, life, very important, involves a minding, a meditative minding, this pause effect that Bala says, and it involves dipping into that which is unpleasant, is my view. And I'm not surprised that AK puts the first principle of meditative inquiry as to do this without fear. And another place in the book, he says, you know, there's so much anti-education out there, and I agree. And he's suggesting that this meditative inquiry is, in a way, the great virtue. It's the great path to a type of enlightenment, in a way. To get back to true education is all implied in that movement. So remember, AK is not just the one. He's picking up on a whole thread of dialogue, research and thinking for a long time before him, and inquiry processes, contemplative education processes, spiritual education processes, holistic education processes, all the good virtues. My concern is I read the book and I read people talking about meditative inquiry and AK in that presentation that he particularly surrounds and gives an umbrella for, with a lot of differences, which is great. I'm always snooping for, but what is the ideological, what is the herd mind, the group consciousness, and the institutional consciousness that unfortunately, when you take something so beautiful and wonderful like many of us have as progressive, innovative educators over the many millennium, perhaps at least in the decades I've been around, I've watched so many movements and new ideas come in to bring, and Ashwani AK ends the book with, you know, that this will bring, you know, this is the movement toward compassion and peace and love. You could go light. And again, these are just words that people use and play with. I don't know exactly what goes on in the practices of people supporting and following and being part of the meditative inquiry domain. What is being called an existential movement by several people in the book. And I'm going, I don't know how existential it is. I'm concerned. So that's all I'm bringing up today. This is my viewpoint. This is my feelings. I have concerns about that possibility when you drop something so beautiful and so grand and so virtuous into the institutional context of a culture, as I said at the beginning, I don't trust in the first place. Why don't I trust that culture? Well, because I've spent a lot of time living in the culture here, and I'm just talking right now, the culture of a sort of universal culture, if you will, what the indigenous people using the kincentric worldview, right? Kincentric or indigenous worldview, some of those writings, as Four Arrows is one of my colleagues who's taught me a lot about that, says, well, the dominant worldview is controlling most of what is culture today, what we know as culture, and has for hundreds of years, if not thousands. He actually goes back probably 10,000 years ago. We took the wrong turn. And we have this dominant worldview, and our institutions are built on it. And then Foros and others, like Dyson Yunkaporta, writes, I was just reading this morning in his book on worldviews, Sandtalk, you might know of it, some people. It's fear-based. Foros says the same. It's fear-based, the dominant worldview. It's fear-based. So then you can hear, meditative inquiry, like these great virtues, is trying to get to love-based, peace-based, right? Where conflict and war and competition and all the things that we like to put into the vices category is not part of our education, because we're doing all this good stuff. Cooperative, holistic, peace. So I'm just saying, as someone who has spent 4+ decades in the educational sphere and being a critical thinker, and you can hear I'm a skeptic, I'm always coming in to look at the other side, the self-deception potentials. For any movement, any group, it doesn't matter. Once you bring something great into the institutional malaise as a way, and the gravity, the gravitas of the pull of the institutional consciousness, the bureaucratic consciousness, and the dominant world review upon which those operate. And we could critique that, and I see in Meditative Inquiry book, there's lots of good critical theory, philosophy critiques, which is great, bringing that together. And AK is very importantly trying to say, let's not forget to bring contemplative meditative inquiry to all those critical camps. And other theorists in the book and practitioners are saying the same thing, which is great. However, I'm concerned that just with this notion of, so now I'm going to kind of wrap up, without fear, when that's put as the first principle. And again, I'm saying that's not just AK saying that, even though he's putting those words down and putting them pretty prominent. Like, that's a pretty important declaration for a set of key principles. That was my pause. Thanks, Bella. And I want us to pause, and I want AK to pause, and I want all those who are followers and or advocates of meditative inquiry, like any good virtuous practice. What do we mean with our words without fear? So then I look up in the book, all the quotes on fear. PDFs are great, right? Put in, scan all the quotes on fear from all the different people. And then I assess that. So that's the fearologist part of me, as you know, in my introduction. It's called the fearologist. It's obviously self-labeled, but it's actually a totally serious commitment I've had for 33 years that I put with my education. And that's transdisciplinary. And then I look at, oh, well, what about fearlessness? So how does that talk about in the book? So I look it up. Well, fearlessness only shows up once. It shows up once with any kind of significant substantive discussion, and that was by David Sobel, I believe. David Sable, and meditative mindfulness person. I don't know his work, but he writes about it as being important to the aspect of complementing kindness, fearlessness and kindness. And that's very much found in a lot of the Eastern traditions. And it's also part of what's called the gift of fearlessness cultures in the Eastern, Southeast Asian cultures. Yeah, there's some really good scholarship on the gift of fearlessness. Well, what does that mean? And then we have Ashwani's first principle, AK's first principle, coming out as without fear. Is a without fear the same as fearlessness in the gift of fearlessness traditions from the East? Well, that's not been discussed as far as I can see in the literature on meditative inquiry. And that's to me a blank spot. There's a blind spot that I'm concerned about in the use of language like without fear. What does that mean? And so when you spend 30 years like I do as an educator, philologist, etc., in the problems that what we need to do is deconstruct and reconstruct the very conception of fear in a dominant worldview, because that dominant worldview impacts and is embedded in the lens on everything we do. And so that's where we have to be so cautious, is my view, in a good way, in a good skeptical, philosophical way, cautious, not in a pessimistic, cynicistic kind of way. I'm not interested in that. That's not the path of fearlessness. This is not the fearlessness worldview I'm promoting in my work. But there's some gaps missing in the understanding of fear and fearlessness that I'm concerned about in the book. And especially when we have this dominant worldview and we have other worldviews that need to be brought in. And I'm glad that meditative inquiry is obviously bringing in a lot of views from the East. I see a lot of people in the book, or at least a few, which is great, from the indigenous traditions coming in and giving their viewpoints. That's great. So meditative inquiry is off on a good start, in my opinion, for those who care about my opinion about it. However, when I look up this first principle, and it's just an interesting kernel, it's not all of Ashwani's work, and it's not all of the work of meditative inquiry, but it's a very, yes, there's a first principle. That's got to be taken seriously. What do you mean without fear? How do you or we or anyone know what fear actually is?
3-minute warning.
Yeah. Another pause. It's very challenging in studying the work of fear and sharing it with people. And I've attempted to share my work in the academy for over 3 decades. And it's not being picked up generally. I'm not cited in the book, which is small little ego hurt of mine. You're putting that as your first principle, and my work's not being cited when I've been publishing on this for 30 years. Fear and fearlessness in education. But you see, the point is not that. It's some common discourse. Of course, we're saying, yeah, we'd love to live without fear. We'd love our students to be in classrooms and teachers to be in classrooms like Mike, as I read earlier, right? I don't want to go in there with fear, he says, and quoting from the book. And I go, yeah, but what is fear? What do you mean by that? So it's fine we have a common sense understanding of what fear is. And I'm just asking the whole world, the umbrella, and all the folks around meditative inquiry to really think and pause. Philosophically, critically, meditatively, dialogically, however we do that inquiry into our principles themselves. And so if that principle is being put forward, and I'm fine that it's there as a first principle, okay, but I want to know, I seriously want to know what kind of inquiry is going into each of those principles as actual critical reflective praxis on the part of all who practice the practice and use the term meditative inquiry, so it doesn't just become another virtue signaling, just like peace education or love or all these wonderful virtues. They don't just become nice signals to attach to, or pluralistic, or whatever it might be. These come into education all the time, and they come into these institutional settings. So is higher education, as I finish, is higher education actually capable as an institutional complex, which many of the people in the book are part of. I'm not. I'm an independent scholar, even though I've obviously, become institutionalized for many years. Is that institutional complex of thinking and the way we live and get our paychecks, speaking to everybody who's dependent on those institutions, are we going to really inquire accurately into something as important as that first principle? So I'll end my talk there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I always feel like I need to give pause for thought after anyone's presentation, but I'm still going to move on, and maybe we can all give thought towards the end for the question time. So, Dr. Resmer, I'm passing over to you right now. And again, I'll give you a 3-minute warning.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with that. I think I need a chance to pause and think. Tough act to follow. It's asked a lot of really important questions. Thank you. I'm just going to prep my screen here. There, hopefully everyone can see that okay now.
Yes, that's fine.
Great, thank you. So I just want to start by thanking very much Ashwani and the entire conference team for organizing this wonderful event and for this opportunity to discuss with you my thoughts on meditative inquiry and how it helped shape my teaching and learning in the chemistry lab. And also thanks to all the book contributors for your valuable insights and to my fellow conference presenters. And I'm glad to be present here on the final day. And although it's very rare for me to do this, I just finished this talk this morning because throughout the conference presentations and resulting discussions over the past few days, I kept hearing these great nuggets of information that challenged and connected to my own thoughts around meditative inquiry. And I kept evolving my thoughts with these new insights. So thank you. And it truly is an honor to be part of this session. Though I must admit, when I first was asked to talk at this event, my first instinct was to say no. Then, of course, I sat and reflected on this, and then I read several chapters of the book, Engaging with Meditative Inquiry in Teaching, Learning, and Research, and the book resonated so much with me. So why was my first instinct to say no then? I think because I have no formal education in teaching. I come from a science background. I conduct experiments with easy to define control groups and data that can be processed and analyzed. And I was struggling with the similar questions of the laboratory that Dr. Michael Corbett presented in his talk the other day. And fortunately, Ashwani wrote in his introduction to the book this passage that summarized this tension that I was feeling. So he writes, why do certain forms of knowledge count as valid and scientific and others do not? What is the role and limits of science as the path to collect knowledge about the world and the purposes for which the collected knowledge is used? What role can intuition and intrinsic intelligence play in the process of knowledge creation? So for me, meditative inquiry is powerful, and it causes me to think deeply about myself, my role as a human and as an educator, but I can't test the effects of me engaging and not engaging with meditative inquiry. So this isn't data driven. There is no right answers, no list of steps to take. It's just me grappling with these ideas in my own laboratory. So this talk is a personal account of how meditative inquiry has helped me grow and learn and accept myself. Though I am new to the process, there's been some comments here about how people are engaging with meditative inquiry without realizing it. And I think I felt the same. I was unfamiliar with the terminology, the core principles, but once reading the book and learning more, I found myself connecting and finding examples of how meditative inquiry and how it has positively impacted my teaching and learning. And then so to be true to myself, I'll avoid the abstract and I'll give some concrete examples of applying it to my teaching. And hopefully, given my background in the hard science, I can show you that even chemists can find ways to apply meditative inquiry into our teaching, learning, and research. So for my teaching context, here is a photo of the lab that I work in. So this is MSVU's first year chemistry lab, and usually it's filled to the brim with 32 students experimenting. And this photo is taken at the end of the day when most of the students have left. So in the foreground, we have a bunch of chemistry glassware, lots of colorful solutions, some hot plate books. And then in the background, we can see myself, the TA, and a couple students experimenting in the lab. And so this photo is taken when students are working on their individual projects. We can see it's chaotic, it's messy, but it represents a lot of authentic learning that I'll discuss later. So I'm very fortunate to work at Mount St. Vincent University, known for its small classes, and I can really get to know my students, interact with them individually. I often will teach the same students year after year in the lab, since I teach a variety of first, second, and third year labs. So watching those students grow, develop confidence and new skill sets is truly a joy to experience. This also provides great opportunity to develop relationships and connect deeply with students, and for students to connect with their peer group, really helping to build that learning community. Also, being at a small university, it allows for a lot of interdisciplinary connections. So I'm so fortunate to work alongside with and learn from many colleagues that help to inform my teaching and learning practices. So the lab is a unique teaching environment that really lends itself naturally to dialogue. It's the place to do science. So here is a picture of myself and a student in the lab. And it's hard to tell here who the teacher is, but here the student in the white coat is explaining to me her experiment that she researched and set up as part of her year-end project. So I'm here asking questions to learn more about the project, and she is telling me, demonstrating her knowledge in an informal setting. So this dialogue is so valuable, and the lab really lends itself naturally to these informal yet very informative conversations between student and instructor, but also importantly, the student-student interaction. So the lab really has this potential to spark curiosity and creativity, but care must be taken to design activities to support this. But then, of course, the COVID pandemic hit, and suddenly my lab looked like this. So sitting in front of a computer screen by myself. And suddenly all of those hands-on activities were done on a screen. I missed out on those rich conversations with students. I couldn't walk around the lab and just ask, going okay, with a smile on my face, which always seems to spark those great conversations, reflections, and observations from students. Now students had to click their mouse to get a reaction. So they were missing out on all those senses that were engaged in the lab. And the thought of moving a chemistry lab online 3 years ago would have seemed just absolutely impossible. And it really does remain a blur how I actually did it for all the many labs I teach. And predictably, this led to intense burnout for me, not only due to the incredible amount of work, but also because the online lab really went against my core beliefs, my teaching philosophy for lab learning. There was little opportunity for those connections, promoting that sense of wonder, and relationship building was difficult to foster behind the screens when we were all so exhausted from being in front of our computers all day long during the pandemic. And I'd also like to thank Yelena Smith for sharing their COVID burnout story. I was glad to hear I wasn't alone. And like Yelena, learning from Ashwani and engaging in meditative inquiry was a great anecdote to burnout. So as I was preparing for the return to in-person learning, there was this great session last summer led by Ashwani on holistic ways of leading an academic life. And there's a video on Ashwani's YouTube video, and I encourage you to check it out, that really critique this productivity model of academia, and it was just the right thing that I needed. And so returning to the lab, I thought a lot about me as an instructor. So I needed to make sure that I was mentally strong so that I could foster a supportive learning environment. As they say, don your own oxygen mask first. And this is just essential for educators. So I made sure to take time for myself, set up boundaries in terms of work and email were effective, and definitely taking lots of time to enjoy nature. So throughout my career, I've been thinking critically about effective ways to learn in the lab. And upon a return back to in-person learning, we had limited time in the lab as the lab was operating on half capacity, where one group was in person, the other group was online, and then we switched each week. So I had to carefully redesign all the lab activities. So I had to question and critique each experiment and each lab experience to make sure it was a rich learning experience and a good use of the minimal lab time we had. So I really focused on that question, what is worth learning? And I'll share some of these lab developments. So one area of development is moving away from cookbook labs. So these are labs where students simply follow recipe. There's an expected way to complete the lab and expected outcomes. So while they do have their place when learning new techniques, it does dampen the enthusiasm, creativity, and curiosity in the lab. Alternatively, inquiry-based labs are a way to allow students to research a topic or research a question of their own choice, allowing students to develop their own sense of being a scientist, allowing for more creativity and freedom in the lab. So there was some great discussion in yesterday's book contributors panel about inquiry, and building from there, there are various levels of inquiry-based lab learning. So if we start at the bottom of this pyramid, that would be more of our cookbook style labs where lots of direction and scaffolding is in place. And then as we go up that pyramid, less directions are given and students are tasked with creating their own solutions to problems. So I usually aim for somewhere in the middle there, allowing students to first practice a technique and then allow them to ask their own research question using that technique and design a procedure to test their hypotheses. And interestingly, there is rarely two students asking the same question. So this really leads to students pursuing something they're interested in learning more about and hopefully motivating that lab learning. However, asking questions is not easy for many who have always been told what to do. So to start encouraging this questioning process on the very first lab day, I'll have students watch a video of a chemistry demonstration and just have them ask as many questions as possible. And the questions don't have to be scientific. It could be, why is it that color? And then we take all of those questions and then start pulling out some potential research questions and then work together on developing a hypothesis to test that research question. So this process helps students realize that simply being curious, cultivating that sense of wonder, asking questions freely without judgment is a key element of being a scientist. And then at the very top of that pyramid, we have authentic inquiry. And in chapter 12, Dr. Krista Ritchie describes how they observed a grade 10 inquiry-based science classroom where each student answered their own research question of their own choice and topic and came up with unique procedures. So this is incredibly challenging and it does require a lot of planning, organization, but I only do this on a small scale myself, usually at the year-end project. And at the start of every term, I try to incorporate a similar project I call Choose Your Own Experiment, where students get to choose the research question to study on their own, sparking curiosity, but also valuing students' decision to study what they are interested in and what they think is worth studying. So they are only limited by the equipment, chemicals, and of course, lab safety. I even do this in the relatively large first year chemistry labs. So there I have students present a chemistry demonstration of their own choice. They perform the demonstration in front of their class of their own design. And years later, I'll have students tell me that they remember their chem dem, or students will mention that this activity played a critical role in deciding to pursue studies in science. So just a nice example of meaningful and lasting learning. So I've been appreciating these calls for appreciating silence and being comfortable with silence. So I'm a big introvert. I'm also very shy and quiet. So I need that quiet and time to process my thoughts. I need recharging after lots of interactions. And I was at a conference recently and someone put up a slide like this at the beginning, and it just was exactly what I needed to see. And I thought my students could benefit from this. So this past summer when I was teaching online, I put up this slide at the very first class and it reads, "Welcome to Chemistry 112L. Come in, take some deep breaths, enjoy some quiet time before our session begins at 1:30. And it was just a way of inviting students to take time for themselves, however they needed. It was just an easy way to invite some quiet into the space without needing to do something formal or a more meditative sequence. And then finally, I was glad that we touched on grading this morning because I'm really excited to talk about it. So removing measurements and grades has always been something that's interested me. So grades tend to lead to gaming the system, or students doing what they think they need to do to just get that A, or writing what they think the teacher wants to hear rather than engaging with the learning process. And I agree that students tend to be mark driven. So it also leads to a lot of grade anxiety. And I know personally, I would say things like, oh, fail stands for first attempt in learning, yet I didn't provide any support structures to allow for failure and making mistakes. These errors were penalized for grade-wise. So I was hesitant to take the change, especially given all these deeply rooted norms of grading, and especially in my early years of teaching. However, I knew that things needed to change, and to address these challenges, just this past winter term, I ungraded one of my labs, and I was fortunate because I only had 12 students in it. So it was realistic for me to implement a portfolio-based system, since I knew at the end of the term, I would have the time and energy to evaluate 12 lab portfolios. And also this was a group of highly motivated chemistry majors, and I had taught them all in the lab before. So they trusted me with trying something new. They knew that I had their best interest in mind. I was swimming in the water with them. So whenever I try something new, I try to explain my rationale behind it. I share the books and the articles that I read that led me to this decision to try something new, to hopefully get student buy-in and just have them understand my thought process as well. And then, as was previously mentioned, I use inquiry labs. I use materials from POGLE PCL, process-oriented guided inquiry learning, in the physical chemistry lab. And by ungrading, it offers a way for students to experiment without worrying about losing marks for making mistakes on their way to learning. So here is how I structured the ungrading. So each week, as usual, students had to hand in their weekly lab reports. However, these reports were not graded. There were no marks given. I only delivered feedback. The emphasis was on using that feedback received to strengthen their evidence in their final lab portfolio. So no matter the level of report, everyone got detailed feedback. One thing I would change is next time I would just add a 3-point scale, just to give students the sense of how they did. 1, it needs revisions. 2, it meets expectations, and 3, it exceeds expectations. So this would just be a little helpful, because some were already at the A+ level, while others didn't have a good understanding yet of the material. And students don't often have this practice of evaluating their own work. So it can be a bit of a shock for students who are just so conditioned with all of those deeply rooted grading systems. It would also be helpful, since there's no way to assign something in our course management system without grades associated with it. So having that point system would also help to alert students that there's feedback there for them to view. Just another example of these deeply rooted systems. I didn't want students to leave this lab portfolio to the very end of the term. So I had a midterm check-in where students submitted drafts of their portfolio. And to encourage dialogue, I had students could have the option to check in with me with an oral discussion, but knowing that not all students are comfortable with doing that, they could also submit it in writing. And at the midterm, I also have students check in with me to see how things are going. So I'm mindful when doing new things, and I'm not afraid to change the plans if things aren't going well, as I just did this summer. So when I presented this ungrading at the start of the term, I asked students how they were feeling, and I got an overall sense of relief with this ungrading process and just an overall enthusiastic response. But I also
This is a 3-minute warning.
Oh, thank you. I did offer the option of sticking with the traditional grading method if students want it. And then the midterm check-in with an anonymous survey, just to make sure things are still going well for the students. And then again, making sure to change the plan if needed. And then at the end of the term, they hand in their final lab portfolio. And in their portfolio, they reflect on what they think their lab grade should be. They provided a response on why they assigned that lab grade, reflected on it, and then provided evidence to support their rationale, such as a copy of their lab calculations, a video demonstrating a lab skill, or a scan of their notebook page. I try not to limit the possibilities for this evidence, allowing students to choose how to demonstrate their learning process. And at the end, I would adjust the marks up and down if needed. So overall, I would say it worked really well. Students were less grade anxious. They were more willing to be creative, since they weren't penalized if they didn't say or do the right thing. It allowed flexibility, since there were no penalties for not handing in a lab report. They just didn't get that feedback if it wasn't handed in on time. I really enjoyed grading this way. I wasn't so worked up in deducting 1 mark here, 0.5 there. I was just providing that rich feedback, which is a lot of fun. And students were more open to taking risks. So for example, in the lab, a student noticed an interesting observation. They decided to pursue it, change their original plan, change their research question. And unfortunately, the experiment ultimately was not successful. It didn't lead to anything. Their hypothesis was nulled, but there is no grade penalty. It was okay to make those mistakes. They were able to pursue something they were found interested in, and they were more motivated to learn more about inspiring that curiosity. And then finally, I'll just say, since a lot of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math classes can be very large, the portfolio method is not suitable for these large classes. So as an alternative, I would recommend specifications grading. So here is a great article from my colleague, Dr. Renee Link, who discusses how she incorporated this alternative grading practice into the lab with over 1,000 students. So I'll just end by sharing some references and resources that has helped guide me over making these decisions, and lots of resources on grading. I find this is an exciting new field, and I just thank you very much for this opportunity again, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And thank you, Michael and Bella. If I could ask you to turn your cameras on again, please. And then I can bring you back into the room. Okay, perfect. And for everyone that's listening, the chat is now open. So I ask you, anyone that has any questions, to please share them in the chat. And perhaps the three of you, to put you further in the spotlight, 3 very different presentations. I mean, you come from 3 very different disciplines. You've taken 3 very different approaches in your interactions with meditative inquiry. Do you have any comments or questions for each other?
Well, first of all, I just appreciate a scientist doing what you're doing, Resmer.
Yeah, if there are no comments, then let me begin. Okay, somebody is asking me about the pause. Over the period of time in the civilizational growth, any civilization for that matter, we have been giving excessive stress on human action. And even ethics that we attribute is only for human action. So what to do, what not to do, what ought to do, right? So this has been a continuous process. And of course, action and continuous process of action is part of the nature, and that is how it is part of us as well, human beings which are into nature. But you know, nature has a wonderful capacity or capability of rejuvenating itself, recuperating itself. Okay, whenever it gets polluted, it has the power of recuperating. And it is not that only nature has this. See, if water gets polluted, it has the power to purify itself. If the air gets polluted, it has its own inbuilt capacity of purifying itself. Okay, but it gets continuously polluted for over a period of time, then it becomes difficult for it to manage itself. Similarly, if you look at human being, we are all produced of cells, and these cells are the basic component of the individual. And all over the body, we think that we are individuals, but actually we are only composed of small, tiny cells, right? And these cells, they work hard, and they also have life. They come into existence and they die, okay? And the death of a cell happens in such an automatic way that it gets immediately replaced by another cell, and that's how we don't realize the replacement process that is happening inside us, okay? So now the cell also, it works hard to give whatever energy and the processes that are happening inside, and it in the process of time, it also gets like accumulated. It accumulates certain things that are not required. And how does it how does it cure itself out of that unwanted thing? You know, for that, you just have to stop eating. You stop eating, and then your cell becomes healthy by eating its own waste. Okay, so it's a simple logic that tells us, that's a part of the nature that tells us that Yeah, you work is important. Human action is important, not just human action, the action that happens around us, it's all important, but you have to pause. That's how you have night. Okay, it's not just day, you also have night. Right, which tells us, no, it's available in the nature. It tells us that you pause for a minute. Only if you pause, then you would internalize it, you would recuperate yourself from the unwanted stuff. Because one of the most nonsensical things that is happening in the contemporary life is emotional and rational constipation. How do you get rid of this constipation? You have to pause. You have to pause this rationality for some time. You have to pause this emotionality, excessive emotional indulgence for some time, and then give yourself sufficient time. Okay. And it could be meditation for 10 minutes a day or 10 minutes a week, whatever, because there is no stipulated rule for everybody, that fits to every individual. We all have to invent our own mechanisms of recuperating ourselves from the mental and emotional stigmas. So this is what meditative inquiry actually tries to help us. But of course, I also believe that one has to invent his own method of meditative inquiry. But I also believe that there should be a guided kind of meditative inquiry, which helps the individual initially to discover the pattern that is suitable for the individual. So this is what I would believe to be the pause. Just one comment on Fisher. It's very important to be fearless. And this stigma of fear around us in the society really disturbs us, and that's what creates more anxiety, etc., etc. But the other side of the fearlessness is that it creates a kind of violent society as well. So these are two extremes that we have to look at. Fear creates fear within you. Okay. And that is how you tend to be overcautious, and you tend to withdraw yourself. And the other side of the fear is fearlessness is like it may lead to a kind of violent society. So that's how meditative inquiry is should help individuals to be fearful, to be fearless as well, responsibly. The tag that is to be attached, or the underlining or highlighting point that is required for both fear. You have to be fearful. I would say that, no, you should never be fearless. You should be fearless, you should be fearful as well. But how do you balance these two? Where to use them in a responsible way is more important for the individual. That's where I believe meditative inquiry, it's not just meditation. It is meditative inquiry into human actions and the knowledge that you receive, which would be really helpful to all of us. So yeah, that's where I would stop. Thank you.
Well, it's a good place to, I'll jump in and respond to one of the questions that's related to all of what you just shared, Bella. And I do believe, Resmer, you actually at one point talked about fear in the students as well, and the teachers, the instructors, in evaluation, how that affects inquiry processes, experimental, etc. So I'm kind of curious to hear too how you would frame fear or fearlessness or courage, whatever you want to do. But the question to me was, I made reference to fearlessness, but did not define it. And of course, to ask a philosopher to define a concept that they've spent 30 years on in umpteen seconds is like a nightmare. So I'm going to start with that. And the reason I actually say that and pause on it, it's not just humorous. It's actually a serious questioning. It's a questioning of the question. And it's a questioning of the motivation of the question. And well, why would I do that? Why would I question our motivation to know fearlessness? I have a lot of reasons to question our motivation to know fearlessness. The one reason is that we can see fearlessness as an escape from our anxiety and fear. Escapes are always the pill, the potential rescue, the potential, transcendence, the potential happiness that I'll get if I get to fearlessness, right? And so, but what am I getting away from? So fearlessness has this very interesting thing in it, right? It's fearlessness. And a lot of people are not quite so nuanced in my experience, and a lot of literature and education for it's still very heavy. Is pedagogy of love, a curriculum of love. So let's just move from a fear-based to a love-based. And that is, to me, even more nightmare. And I joke about it, and I'm incredibly serious about it, because that tendency to want to go to the virtue, and you heard that in my talk, it's a virtue seduction in any kind of awareness processing and development and enlightenment, whatever we might term as the processes of learning and development, and trajectories of aims, right? When we set aims and we want to move somewhere. And so I think I like what you just said, Bella. You really said we have to be fearful and fearless at the same time. Well, that's another interesting nightmare, epistemologically, ontologically, and so many other ways. Philosophers could go a long time on that, but I'll just leave it over. If Resmer, you have anything to add, go for it. If not, that's fine.
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about this concept of fear. And I think especially being in the chemistry lab, there are lots of fears in terms of the hazards that we deal with, right? We have the physical hazards. Lighting a Bunsen burner gives a lot of fear in the students, but I make students light the Bunsen burner, even if they're scared of it. And it gives them confidence once they accomplish that. So I think, I don't really know where I'm going with that, but I'll just throw that out there. And also, I think around the fearlessness or fear of grading. And I really think that limits a lot of students for their creativity, because we're so wrapped up in grades. Students need grades for their scholarship. They need grades to get into med school and graduate school. So I don't blame them for being or wanting the good grades, but at the same time, it really, in my experience, can hinder a lot of that learning and trying new things. So I think that fear of being graded and being evaluated is something that we're going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about. Yeah, thanks.
I have a quick few thoughts, if I may share. Thank you, Professor Bala, so much. I really enjoyed that you connected meditative inquiry to the spiritual heritage of India. I think it's very much connected to that, and a lot of insights, like even if you see the book begins with Song of Creation from Rig Veda, the hymn of creation. So this inquiry is not something new. It has always been going on. But the beauty of this is that this is a wheel that you also have to always reinvent for yourself. Nobody can inquire for you, and then you can use that knowledge without giving life it through your own inquiry. So it's a lab. It's a laboratory in which you are the experimenter and you are the experimented. So I think that's very important. And Kelly, I really loved your examples from your teaching. I think they are so insightful and inspiring, because many people ask, okay, what can I do in science classroom, maths classroom? They don't allow for that. But I think if we do that, it's very possible if we pay attention to that. And it's always a fun to hear to Michael and to interact with him. Michael and I had a dialogue on fear at some point, and it was published in his Journal of Fear Studies, International Journal of Fear Studies. I have posted the link if anybody wants to check it out. It was a very interesting dialogue. And in my first book, Curriculum as Meditative Inquiry, I have explored this problem of fear to quite a great extent. So if anybody wants to look at how fear impacts us as human beings and in the context of education, you might enjoy that. And definitely one of the big sources of my understanding is J. Krishnamurti. So, and he has talked a lot about fear and other emotions and how they impact our lives and all that. So thank you so much again, Kelly and Michael and Bala, for being here. It's really heartwarming that you took the time to study the text and share your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you all. We are actually at the end of the session, due to stop at 10:02. And I'll ask the presenters, if you haven't had a chance, you should read through the comments And if you wanted to, you can download them by clicking the 3 buttons just above where you would enter a chat, and it will ask you if you want to save the chat, and then you can do so. I'm going to share my screen now, which is simply this afternoon's sessions. So we're going to be stopping for lunch now. And